In the fall of 1981, on a cattle ranch near the small town of Meeteetse, Wyoming, a dog named Shep trotted up to the house with something dead in his mouth. His owners, John and Lucille Hogg, took it from him and turned it over in their hands. It was a small, slender animal with a black mask across its eyes and dark feet, and they did not recognize it. So they did the ordinary thing. They carried it into town to a taxidermist, and the taxidermist went pale because he knew exactly what he was looking at. It was a black-footed ferret, the rarest mammal in North America, an animal that scientists had recently given up as gone. A ranch dog had just carried home a species the world believed was extinct. That single dead ferret set off one of the strangest rescues in American history, a chain of events that would run for more than 40 years. It would pass through a freezer in San Diego, where a scientist named Oliver Ryder was about to make a quiet decision that mattered far more than he could have known. And it would end with researchers bringing an animal back from cells taken out of a creature that had been dead for over 30 years. This is the story of how we cloned the dead to save the living and whether it actually worked. To understand why one dead ferret mattered so much, you have to understand how completely this animal had already vanished. If you like stories of animals clawing back from the edge, subscribe. The black-footed ferret is a creature of the open plains, and its entire life is built around one other animal, the prairie dog. Ferrets hunt prairie dogs. They raise their young inside old prairie dog burrows. They spend nearly their whole lives down in those sprawling underground towns. For thousands of years, the plains held hundreds of millions of prairie dogs, and the ferret moved among them like a shadow. It is a strange and specialized little hunter, no heavier than a can of soup, with a black bandit's mask across its face and a habit of standing straight up out of a burrow to read the dark. A black-footed ferret can spend almost its entire life underground, chasing prairie dogs through their own tunnels and killing prey nearly its own size in total blackness. A single ferret needs a great deal of healthy prairie dog down to survive. Bind a species that tightly to one source of food and shelter, and you bind its fate to that animal completely. Then the land was settled, and the prairie dog was branded a pest. Ranchers and government programs poisoned the towns across millions of acres to free up grass for cattle. And as the prairie dogs disappeared, so did the predator that could not live without them. By the middle of the 20th century, the black-footed ferret was barely seen at all. In 1979, after the last one in captivity died, many scientists quietly decided the species was finished, extinct, a small, almost unnoticed casualty of turning the prairie into pasture. That is exactly where things stood when Shep carried one home 2 years later. Once the taxidermists sounded the alarm, biologists rushed to the ranch country around Meeteetse and began searching the prairie dog towns after dark, sweeping the ground with spotlights, hunting for the green shine of a ferret's eyes looking back at them. And they found them. A small wild colony had been clinging on in the Wyoming hills, completely unknown to the outside world, the last of their kind on the planet. Over the next few years, that colony was watched and counted as it climbed to around 130 animals. For one brief stretch, it looked as though the ferret had quietly saved itself, and all anyone had to do was leave it in peace. But this is where the story nearly ended for good. In the middle of the 1980s, 2 diseases swept through the Meeteetse colony at almost the same time. The first was canine distemper, which is very nearly a death sentence for a ferret. The second was sylvatic plague, caused by the same bacterium behind the human Black Death, a disease that kills both the ferrets and the prairie dogs they live on. The colony that had survived a century of poisoning began to collapse, and fast. Biologists were left with an agonizing choice. They could leave the animals in the wild and watch the species blink out a second time, now permanently, or they could try to capture every last one of them and gamble everything on saving the species in cages. They chose the gamble, and the first hand went terribly. In the autumn of 1985, biologists brought in 6 ferrets to start a captive colony. Within days, one of them began showing the signs of canine distemper, and then another, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. All 6 died. The very disease they were racing to outrun had walked into the cages with the animals. It was a devastating beginning, and it made the stakes brutally plain. If the plague and the distemper reached the last wild ferrets before they could be moved, the species was simply over. So the team went back out into the cold and brought in every animal they could find. When that desperate round of captures was finished, the entire black-footed ferret species left on Earth amounted to 18 animals. 18. That was the whole world's supply of black-footed ferrets, held in a handful of enclosures, and the bottleneck pulled tighter still because not all of them would breed. In the end, only 7 of those founders successfully passed their genes forward. Sit with that number for a moment. Every black-footed ferret alive today, and more than 10,000 kits have been born in the program since, traces back to just 7 animals. The captive breeding itself worked almost beyond hope. Ferrets were raised and carried back out onto the plains, and the species hauled itself up from 18 survivors to hundreds. Yet, there was a quiet flaw buried inside that triumph. A whole species rebuilt from 7 parents is dangerously inbred. It carries almost no genetic variety, which leaves it brittle, slower to fight off disease, slower to adapt to a changing world. The ferret had survived, but it had passed through the needle so narrow that its long-term future was still very much in question. Still, the comeback was real, and it spread. Beginning in the early 1990s, captive-born ferrets were carried back out and set loose on the plains, first in Wyoming, then across a widening map. Over the years, they were returned to Montana, South Dakota, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Kansas, and New Mexico, and even across the borders into Mexico and Canada, dozens of release sites scattered through the animal's old range. One of those sites should sound familiar. The black-footed ferret was brought back to the Rocky Mountain Arsenal outside Denver, the old chemical weapons site turned wildlife refuge, where the prairie dog towns that had quietly taken over the poisoned ground were waiting to feed them. Today, a few hundred black-footed ferrets live in the wild once more, spread thin across that patchwork of grasslands. It is a fragile thing, held up by constant human effort. But it is real, which carries us back to that freezer in San Diego and the quiet decision made by Oliver Ryder. Ryder helped run a place at the San Diego Zoo with a strange and wonderful name, the Frozen Zoo, a vault of liquid nitrogen tanks holding the living cells of hundreds of vanishing species. The idea behind it sounded almost like science fiction at the time. Gather the living cells of animals on the brink, freeze them deep in liquid nitrogen, and bank them against some future in which the tools might exist to actually use them. A library of life stored at hundreds of degrees below zero, holding the genetic blueprints of more than 1,000 species. Most of those as samples would simply wait, perhaps forever, quiet insurance against a loss that had not happened yet. In 1988, cells from a few of the original wild ferrets were sent there and frozen, among them a female named Willa. Willa died without ever raising a single pup. She left no children, no line, nothing but her body and the cells now sleeping in a tank. By every ordinary measure, her genes were gone from the world. Except they were not, because someone had thought to save them. And many years later, when scientists were finally able to read Willa's frozen genome, they found something extraordinary. She carried roughly 3 times the genetic diversity of every living black-footed ferret combined. Sealed in that vault was the exact thing the species needed most and could no longer make for itself. Fresh blood from an animal that had been dead for over 30 years. For a long time, there was nothing anyone could do with that frozen promise. You cannot breed a cell in a tank. But cloning slowly improved, and in 2013, the Fish and Wildlife Service joined forces with a conservation group called Revive and Restore to attempt something never before done with an endangered American species. they would try to clone Willa. Working with a company that had already cloned a rare wild Mongolian horse, they took the genetic material from Willa's thawed cells, placed it into prepared eggs, and implanted those into a surrogate mother, an ordinary domestic ferret. And on the 10th of December 2020, that surrogate gave birth to a single healthy kit. They named her Elizabeth Ann. She was an exact genetic twin of a ferret that had died decades before she was born, and she was the first endangered species native to the United States ever brought into the world through cloning. A dead animal had, in the truest sense, come back. For a species choked down to the genes of 7 animals, that was not just a headline. It was missing. A clone of Willa would carry variation that had been missing from the gene pool for over 30 years, the kind of fresh blood that no amount of careful pairing among the living could ever invent. If it truly worked, cloning would not merely copy a ferret. It would widen the entire future of the species, reaching back to a dead animal to give the living ones a fighting chance. And here the story takes a turn that most of the headlines skipped right past. Elizabeth Ann grew up strong and healthy, but when the time came to breed her, she could not. She had a physical condition that prevented it, one that shows up in ordinary black-footed ferrets as well, and was not caused by the cloning. The first resurrected ferret, the living proof that the impossible could be done, would not be the one to carry Willa's rare genes into the population. For a few years, it looked like the miracle might be a beautiful dead end. But the team did not stop at one. They went back to Willa's frozen cells and cloned her a second time. In 2024, 2 more copies of Willa were born, named Noreen and Antonia, and this time the chain held all the way through. Antonia grew up, was paired with a wild-born male named Urchin, and that year she gave birth to a litter of kits. It was the first time in history that a cloned endangered animal in this country had ever reproduced. Those kits are something genuinely new on the prairie. Every other black-footed ferret alive descends from 7 founders. These descend from 8 because Willa, dead for nearly 40 years, had finally become a mother through her own clone. The genetic diversity that had been frozen in a tank since 1988 was suddenly flowing through living, breathing animals again. The dead ferret had not simply been copied, she had rejoined her own species. It is hard to overstate how strange and how hopeful this is. A Rantnosdok found an animal the world had buried. Biologists caught the last 18 of them in a desperate gamble. A scientist froze a few cells almost as an afterthought, and 40 years later, those small decisions reached across time and added a long-dead animal's genes back into a living, breeding population. And that same freezer in San Diego still holds the cells of hundreds of other species, some of them already gone from the wild entirely. What happened with Willa is the first real proof that those frozen libraries are not just memorials to what we have lost. They can be doorways back. Yet the very same miracle raises a hard question, and it deserves to be asked out loud. If we can call a species back out of a freezer, if extinction is beginning to look less like a locked door and more like a problem we can engineer our way around, does that knowledge make us more careful with the animals we still have, or less? Subscribe for more wildlife comebacks like this one. The black-footed ferret is still endangered today, still bound to the prairie dog towns we are still poisoning and plowing under. The clone in the laboratory is a genuine wonder. Whether we ever leave it a prairie to live on is the part of this story we have not yet finished writing.